Hey everyone. So today I just thought I was going to be doing some hacking on a RSpec PR that's been floating around for literally months. Um, so sometimes when I have specs and I want to print information out as part of those specs, um, so this is a spec which just looks at throughput for async HTTP, and all it does is it measures the time it takes to transmit a bunch of zeros, and then it just prints it out. How much data, how long it took, oh goodness, and the data rate that occurred. And the problem with this is that this list is a little bit ugly. Uh, so if I run this, maybe I should just run one spec, but oh well. So the indentation of this output is not matching the example that it's within. I just thought, oh, wouldn't it be a bit nicer if it was? Um, I don't know if it really, it doesn't really matter all that much. But everything else is nice indented, so, why not? Surely it can't be that complicated. Famous last words. Um, so I made a PR, and actually, is this even the first message? Oh yeah, it was, but the original commits are gone. So I just said, wouldn't it be nice if example.reporter.message would output the right indentation? And yeah, so that's really what we're going to look at today. The PR has been going on for ages. It's funny how sometimes the simplest things can just go on and on and on because everyone has a specific idea about how it should work, and our ideas don't necessarily align up. But that's okay. That's good. Hopefully, you end up with something that's good and good for everyone. So, RSpec is broken up into a whole bunch of sub projects, and sometimes I find that a little bit confusing. In fact, I'm kind of eating my own medicine because async is done the same way. So you got like RSpec mux, RSpec expectations, RSpec core, RSpec its, and I guess the benefit of that approach, we talked a little bit about this last time, is that if you choose to break your code up into smaller modules, and I guess you can version them independently. You can deprecate them independently. You can, upgrade some, but if you have a project that depends on some legacy thing, you don't have to update it. Hopefully you can update other parts of the system and it will keep on working. Who knows if that's actually feasible. But in the case of RSpec, it's just, I guess, a management thing, which kind of makes sense because RSpec has to run on, I think it runs back as far as 186, which is pretty impressive. Maybe they're going to drop that soon. I don't know. So I have actually let's just add in here. I don't want to search. I just want you to search in the current directory. Okay, let me just do it the slow way. I thought I would be clever, but the system was more clever. Okay, here's RSpec core. And because I originally just typed this patch into GitHub, I guess, it's just called patch 1, which is not a particularly great name for a branch, but that's okay. So, in RSpec, when you run your tests, you can specify different ways of outputting success or failure. The most common ones are printing out like a list of dots, and each dot is the test passing, or you can choose like a documentation formatter, which is my sort of my default, my preference, because I think it's just a little more obvious. And so there's like a flag for doing that, and if you put it in the .rspec file, it's just for your entire project all the time. So that's kind of my default. So that's documentation formatter is all of that stuff. And I guess I don't know what the other one is. Can we just like see it in the help? Progress. Okay. There we go. That's funny. One of them failed when I used the progress format. That's totally crazy. Anyway, let's have a look. So this PR relates to the documentation formatter. And I've already made some changes from master. And so the way this formatter works is it's kind of it's using the delegate or notification pattern. Actually, this kind of reminds me of Objective-C, which has NS notification. So essentially, this class says I have a bunch of events that I'm interested in. Example started, example group finished, example passed, example pending, example failed. These are all kind of callbacks or notifications. And so when example started is called, we get this notification. You can get information about the example that was started, and if you wanted, you could print it out or what have you. So what I did was I just added a buffer of messages, and this buffer, when you start an example, it starts capturing messages. So this method here called message notification, that notification contains the message that the user specified. Let me just jump to that code. Okay, so when you write this example.reporter.message in your spec and you give it some text, that will trigger eventually this function to be called, and that notification.message contains the text you specified. So when there's a buffer for messages, the message gets put in the buffer. Otherwise, it just gets printed out directly. And okay, so why do we do this? Why is there an if statement here? The reason for that is because John, on the PR, he's like the person who basically created RSpec, I guess. I assume that. Actually, I don't know that. He wanted to retain the existing behavior for things outside an example. So what that means is, it's a little bit tricky, but should we just put that over there, put that down there. Okay, so let's have a look at what's going on here. That title, sorry, actually it's not clear. That message is actually coming out in the wrong place. Let me just have a look at this code. So the spec is called client can get resource. That's actually a really crummy name for the spec. Let's fix that too. Client can download data quickly. That's probably better. And what you see is the message came before the title of the spec. Now that's because the title is only printed out when it succeeds or fails. So that's it in itself is a little bit confusing, because if you have a spec and it crashes, you sometimes don't know, like if it hangs, you don't know what spec is being run because the title hasn't come out yet. So what I chose to do was to buffer those messages, and when the example passes or fails, then it flushes the messages out, which puts the message after the name of the spec. So that only happens when you're inside an example. Otherwise, the message comes out as was the previous behavior. So this is like all discussed. It took a while to like nut this all out. It was quite tricky. And so what I thought was, John has given me some feedback on the latest iteration, and I generally agree with what he wants. So I thought it would just be fun to work on that and try and get that PR updated. So the first one is to do with indentation. And it's actually not a complicated change, but it's probably the most controversial change that is requested from my point of view, if you can call this PR controversial. When you output a message, should it be indented one level or not? Or should it be at the same level as the current scope? And I guess the thing is, let's have a look at that spec actually, because I wrote some more specs. It's funny when you write specs to test specs. Right, so it can output indented messages. So we make a root context, we make a nested context, then we make and run an example. We make and run an example, and then we just call reporter.message, which triggers a message to come out. And I guess the question is, should it be that or should it be that? And John thinks it should be that, and I'm personally happy with it being that, because I think, to me, if that is nested, then that should be nested. But you know what? I actually don't think this case matters that much, so I'm just going to do what John wants. And you know, he can think about it, and maybe he'll change his opinion, or he won't. You know, it's his project. I just want to push through this PR, and if some parts are indented and other parts aren't, you know, it doesn't really bother me, as long as the part that I care about is as good as it can be, then I'm happy with that. Right, so the way we achieve that in this code is in here, when we print out a message, the current indentation method that I made, it's really simple. It takes the current group level, which is like how many nested contexts and examples there are, and it adds that offset, and it multiplies that by 2 spaces. Should be a tab. So we just delete that one there, and then it will come out at the same indentation level. So let's see if we can run that, because in theory, well, actually, you know what I should really like? I've changed the spec, right? Let's do some real TDD. RSpec, spec, RSpec, core formatters, documentation. It feels really weird using RSpec to test RSpec. Right, so we changed the spec. It should be this, but it got the previous behavior, which is that. So now let's go ahead and fix it, which is to change a 1 to a 0, which is what does Rick say? Is I topple the Galactic Empire by changing a 1 to a 0. Something quite funny about that. Okay, excellent. So we fixed that issue and the test pass. Perfect. Okay, what was the next issue? Behavior as you requested, but please think about whether it makes sense or not. Personally, I feel that it should be indented the same way at the top. Oh, I don't have that on this computer. Damn. GitHub needs more emojis. That's just not enough. Now, the next issue was John rightly pointed out that I was creating a lot of junk arrays. So I was just using messages to track whether or not it should be logging to the message array or not. So messages starts out as nil. Then when the example starts, we turn it into an array. And if it's not nil, we save and buffer the messages. Then finally at the end, like whether it passes or fails, we call flush messages, which if there were any messages, it prints them all out at the current indentation level +1, and then it sets messages to nil. And I think it's fair enough that I sort of like it when my motivation for designing code like this is that you have one thing which controls the state. So if messages is nil, then you don't do any buffering, and if messages is an array, you do buffering. And what John asked me to do was to have a separate variable called examples running, and save that as an array all the time. So that starts off false. Sorry, my bad. And then when example started, to be honest, like, I don't know if it should be examples running or examples started. It kind of, to me, it makes more sense to use the same name rather than introducing a new one. Example. Let's just do that. Okay, right, so example started equals false, and message is just an array, and then we're in example, so we say example started equals true. That's fair enough. And then if example started, then put the message in there. And then if messages dot any, I don't really like putting that in there now. I think probably should just be in here. John asked me to put that line inside flush messages, but I feel like flush messages, the purpose of that is just to flush the messages, not to terminate or change the state machine of this class. I don't know, I guess you could. Maybe I'll play around with it. I just feel like right now, even though it's like more ugly, to me this is just more logical. Someone might choose to flush messages somewhere else in the code and not realize that it changes the state of how we're dealing with messages. And I think that would be confusing. So anyway, let's see if that still works. Okay, excellent. Nothing actually changed. It was just sort of a cosmetic change. And one might argue that it's slightly more efficient. I guess, yeah, throwing away an array for every example is inefficient. so I agree with that. Alright, so let's have a look at these other points. Understood. Oh, I don't want that button. Resolve conversation. Okay. Resolve conversation. Sometimes when I write code like this for a public project, I kind of think, because obviously everyone has their own opinion about how things should be done, and that's fair enough, like it makes sense. And I've kind of strong opinions about code. Um, my goal is not to go back to John and then for John to go, clearly Samuel didn't understand what I was after. Um, but it's also my goal to be myself when I write code. You know, like I'm just doing this for my own enjoyment, and maybe in this situation because it's educational for others as well. And I think it's a useful contribution. It's just a small one. I mean, it started out small, but it got kind of snowballed into something much more sort of elaborate. Um, I guess in the end, like you want to make changes that are in line with what you think is best, but you want to accept people's feedback. You don't want to like make things too complicated. So that's why I'm just still thinking about that. I think I'll just leave it, and we'll see what John says. He might just go, "Oh, can you move it?" At which point I'll go, "Okay." Right, so let's just commit that bit separately. Don't indent. Don't indent message which is not buffered. And let's see. Maybe I should change it to example running. I feel like example started equals false doesn't read very well. These are the, what is it, like the hard things in programming are naming things in cache and validation. I don't know. It doesn't even matter that much, but sometimes I feel like if you spend an extra 30 seconds on issues like this and you do that across the whole project is so much better for it. When you go on a project and clearly no one has sort of thought about these issues and the naming scheme, like names are just all over the place, and then you definitely feel like this code is bad. So I sometimes think it's worth spending a little bit of time just making sure you get naming things consistently. That's why I would prefer to use the name of the function as the name of the variable, um, because it doesn't introduce a new name or a new concept. It's just saying this function was called. Example started equals false. Let's just leave it. I think it's okay. Prefer to reuse array. I guess we'll see what happens. Is there any chance example started gets called more than once without? Wonder if you can tell my password just by the sound of my keyboard. That would be nuts. Okay. It should have shown up. Alright, well, look, that's all I wanted to really show today. Now that's done, hopefully hopefully that can get merged. Or maybe we're back to the drawing board. We'll see. It's been a couple of months already, so it's not like a few more weeks makes any difference. Excellent. Alright,